She was abandoned, shamed, and sold for pennies, discarded by a town that wanted to erase her. But high in the mountains, one man saw what the world refused to admit. The truth they hid would change everything. Discover how she reclaimed her life, and why he could not turn away. The square was silent now, the townsfolk retreating into the warmth of the general store and the tavern, leaving the wooden stalls empty and dust rising in the late afternoon sun. Sarah Whitlock's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break her chest. Her dress, torn and smudged with dirt from the marketplace, hung loosely on her frame, and every eye that had lingered on her earlier now felt like a knife in her back. She wanted to sink through the floorboards, vanish into the dry soil beneath Pine Ridge, anywhere but here. But there was nowhere to run. She had been sold, literally sold, like a piece of livestock, for pennies that clinked into the money box with the casual cruelty of a town that had decided she was worthless. Caleb Boone had stepped forward with a quiet authority that cut through the humiliation surrounding her. A mountain man by all accounts, he moved like he belonged to the untamed lands rather than to the judgment of men. His eyes were dark, steady, and sharp, and when he spoke, his voice carried over the murmur of the crowd like a low, commanding rumble. He had bought her, and with that act alone, he had silenced the jeering, the pointing, and the whispers. The town seemed to shrink back, unsure of how to respond to someone who did not bend to their petty definitions of worth. Sarah's gaze flickered to him, wary. She did not trust anyone easily. Not after today. Not after the years she had spent trying to exist in the shadows while the town celebrated their own righteousness. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms to hold in the trembling that threatened to betray her. Caleb did not smile. He did not offer comfort. He simply stood there, silent and imposing, watching her as if he could read the lines of shame etched into her very skin. The square emptied faster than she expected, the last few townsfolk hurrying back to their homes, leaving only dust and the echoes of their cruelty behind. Caleb moved closer, closing the space between them. He did not speak, but he reached out, a large, rough hand brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The gesture was careful, almost cautious, but it carried a weight of possession that did not feel threatening. Sarah flinched instinctively, pulling back, but he did not withdraw. He waited. "Come," he said simply, his voice low. There was no question in it, no command. It was a fact, a direction to move forward, and the mountain air seemed to wrap around the words. Sarah hesitated, looking at him through a haze of distrust and shame. The market square, once a place of public judgment, now felt suffocating and hollow. She had nowhere else to go, and the look in his eyes made it clear he would not leave her behind. They walked in silence, Caleb leading her through the narrow streets of Pine Ridge toward the outskirts where the land began to rise into rolling hills and scattered pines. The dust from the town clung to her skirts and ankles, the heat of the afternoon sun baking her skin. Each step felt heavy, but there was a strange relief in moving away from the eyes and voices that had tried to erase her. Caleb did not look at her as one might look at a curiosity, nor did he offer hollow reassurances. He simply walked, steady and deliberate, his presence a shield against the past she could not yet let go of. When they reached the edge of the town, a small clearing appeared before them, shaded by pine trees and bordered by a rocky incline. Caleb paused, finally turning to face her. His expression was inscrutable, but his gaze did not waver. "You are not what they say," he said finally. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an intensity beneath it that made Sarah straighten, her heart catching in her throat. "They do not know you. They only fear what they cannot control." Sarah's lips parted, but no words came. She had been trained all her life to stay silent, to endure the judgment of others without argument. Speaking now felt foreign, like a muscle that had not been used in years. She lowered her eyes, letting them rest on the dust-streaked ground, afraid that looking up might betray the flicker of hope forming in her chest. Caleb studied her closely. He noticed the way her shoulders tensed at his approach, the way her eyes darted to the ground before daring to meet his. He saw the subtle flinch at any movement, the guarded alertness that spoke of a life spent defending against invisible threats. This was no broken woman. She was a survivor, shaped by cruelty and yet unyielding. The town had cast her out, but he could see the spark they had tried to smother. "You do not owe them anything," Caleb said, his voice quieter now, almost intimate. "You are not for them to throw away. Not anymore." Sarah's chest rose and fell rapidly. The words struck her with the force of a revelation she had not permitted herself to consider. For so long, she had carried the shame, believing she had earned it, believing she was undeserving. Caleb's eyes, unwavering and direct, challenged that belief without speaking it outright. She wanted to argue, to tell him that he did not understand, that the town's condemnation had shaped every choice she had ever made. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she followed him in silence to where a narrow path led deeper into the pines. The shade offered relief from the harsh sun, and the scent of pine resin and earth replaced the acrid tension of Pine Ridge. Sarah's steps grew steadier as the distance from the town increased, and with each step, the weight of public scorn seemed to lessen, replaced by something heavier but stranger, a sense of being seen. Caleb did not ask for explanations. He did not demand her story. He merely walked beside her, a silent witness to her existence. They reached a small cabin tucked among the pines, its roof patched with weathered shingles and smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Caleb opened the door with a key he carried on a leather thong around his neck, stepping aside to allow her to enter first. The interior was simple but functional, a hearth with a faint fire, a table with a few chairs, and shelves lined with jars of preserved food and tools. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, a scent that was foreign, yet grounding. Sarah hesitated on the threshold, unsure if she was allowed to claim space in this new world. Caleb's presence behind her was steady, patient, almost protective. "You can stay," he said simply. "You are safe here." The words felt strange, almost unreal, but they carried a weight that resonated deep in her chest. She nodded once, barely, too exhausted to speak. Caleb did not press, did not offer false comfort. Instead, he moved to the hearth, tending the fire, and allowed her a moment to gather herself. As the shadows lengthened outside the cabin, Sarah finally allowed her guard to slip just a fraction. She sank into a chair, her fingers brushing against the rough wood of the table as if it could anchor her to reality. She had been sold for pennies, cast out as worthless, and yet here she sat, still breathing, still alive, with a man who saw her as more than a disgrace. Caleb watched her from across the room, noting the subtle changes in her posture, the way her shoulders eased just slightly, the flicker of curiosity in her eyes as she took in the small comforts of the cabin. He did not speak. He did not need to. He understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned, and she had been through too much to offer it freely. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the cabin grew dim with the fading light. Sarah found herself drawn to the window, looking out at the rolling hills and the darkening pines beyond. The stars began to emerge, pale and distant, and for the first time since morning, she felt the sting of tears, not from shame, but from relief. Caleb joined her at the window, standing close but not touching. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken understanding. He could feel her tension, her wariness, but also the raw intelligence in her gaze, the fierce awareness that had kept her alive through betrayal and cruelty. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, that the town would not forget, and that her wounds were deep. But he also knew something else. She was not broken, not truly. Sarah did not look at him, but she sensed his presence as a promise rather than a threat. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the judgment of Pine Ridge. A life where she was more than a scandal, more than a commodity. The thought was fragile, delicate, but it was real, and it scared her as much as it comforted her. Caleb finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You will not be alone in this. Not if you do not want to be." Sarah's fingers tightened on the windowsill. She did not respond immediately. The words were too simple, too human, and yet they carried the weight of something she had not felt in years: hope. The fire crackled behind them, casting shadows that danced across the walls, and in that quiet cabin on the edge of Pine Ridge, the first step of an unlikely bond began. Sarah Whitlock, sold and scorned, was no longer entirely at the mercy of the world, and Caleb Boone, the mountain man who had seen what others refused to acknowledge, stood as her quiet guardian and witness. The night grew deeper, the stars brighter, and for the first time since the shame of the marketplace, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. She did not know what the future held, or whether the town would ever forgive her, or if she would forgive herself, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity: she had survived. She had been seen. And in Caleb Boone, she sensed the possibility of something she had long thought impossible: a life rebuilt from the ashes of rejection, a life where she could, perhaps, begin again. The fire sputtered and hissed, and Sarah finally lifted her gaze to meet his. There was no declaration, no promise of love yet, but there was recognition, there was understanding. There was the quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that two damaged souls had found, in each other, a fragile shelter from a world that had tried to destroy them. And as the night settled over the pines, Sarah Whitlock, once cast out and sold for pennies, understood the first glimmer of a truth she had never dared to hope for. She was not defined by the town, by its cruelty, or by her past. She was defined by the choices she could make from this moment forward, and for the first time, she felt the faint stirrings of courage to make them. The morning light crept into the cabin through the narrow window, pale and cold. Sarah Whitlock awoke on the rough cot Caleb Boone had shown her the night before, her muscles stiff and sore from sleeping on the thin mattress. The cabin was silent, except for the faint hiss of the fire, still smoldering in the hearth. She shifted carefully, trying not to wake him, though she was certain he was already awake. He always was. She had noticed that, yesterday, how he moved without noise, how his eyes were alert even when he seemed to rest. She rose slowly, her body aching, and went to the small basin Caleb kept near the hearth. The water was icy, stinging against her skin as she splashed it on her face and hands. She felt the dirt from Pine Ridge cling stubbornly to her, the dust from the marketplace yesterday still under her nails. Even here, so far from the town, it was impossible to shake the feeling of shame, the belief that she was nothing more than what the world had called her: broken, discarded, and unwanted. Caleb was already awake when she returned to the cot, standing near the door, his gaze steady and unreadable. He did not speak immediately. He simply watched her, as though weighing her strength, her willingness to move, to endure. Sarah lowered her eyes, shrinking under the weight of his scrutiny. She had learned long ago that obedience was the only path to survival. If she angered him, made a mistake, drew attention to herself, it would only make her position more tenuous. "Get the water from the spring," Caleb said finally, his voice flat, without warmth, "and feed the chickens before the sun gets higher." Sarah's stomach sank at the command. She nodded silently, her throat tight. She had expected no comfort. She had expected no kindness. She had expected only rules, discipline, the quiet authority of a man who had purchased her as if she were property. And that was what she was: property, at least in the eyes of the world. The path to the spring was steep and rocky, cutting through dense pine trees and loose soil. Sarah carried the heavy bucket, her arms straining, muscles burning. Her mind raced with silent calculations. Do not spill. Do not falter. Do not make him angry. Every step was measured, careful, precise. She had done labor before, hard labor, and she knew the price of failure. And yet, she could not help the flicker of anger that rose in her chest. She had been sold, her dignity stripped away, And now she was expected to endure more. More work, more discipline, more silence. Caleb followed her at a distance, his figure steady against the backdrop of trees and rock. He did not offer help, nor did he speak. His presence was heavy, commanding, and Sarah felt it with every step. It was not the same as the townsfolk's cruelty. It was not meant to humiliate. And yet, it carried its own weight. A reminder that she was not free, that she owed obedience, that she was now part of a different kind of ownership. By the time she returned with the full bucket, sweat clinging to her back, Caleb was waiting with the chickens. He stood with arms crossed, watching as she poured the water into the trough and scattered feed across the ground. Every motion was scrutinized, every misstep noted. She did not meet his eyes. She could not. Her pride, fragile and battered, demanded secrecy. She worked quickly, silently, carefully, trying to make herself small, invisible, useful. Once the chores were done, Caleb finally spoke. Stack the firewood, then clean the cabin, then mend the fence. Do not rest until it is all done. Sarah nodded again, her throat dry, her muscles already aching from the morning labor. She wanted to protest, to tell him that her body was spent, that she was no servant, no beast of burden. But words failed her. She had been trained not to speak up, to obey in silence, to endure in quiet. Any other choice had brought pain before. She did not want to find out what would happen if she refused now. The hours dragged on, the sun climbing high and hot above the mountains. Sarah lifted logs, carried water, swept the floor, patched broken boards in the fence. Her hands bled, her back ached, her legs shook. She worked through it all, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. Obedience was survival. Silence was protection. And Caleb Boone's eyes, steady and unyielding, never left her, reminding her at every moment that she was not free, that she owed him her labor, her compliance, her quiet endurance. Caleb himself worked beside her at times, stacking firewood, repairing the fence, hauling supplies from the storage shed. But even then, he remained distant. He did not smile. He did not offer comfort. He spoke only when necessary, with a calm authority that carried weight beyond words. Sarah could feel his judgment, though it was not cruel. It was exacting, measured, and it forced her to confront herself in ways that were almost unbearable. As the sun began to lower behind the mountains, Sarah collapsed briefly against a stack of firewood, breathing heavily, sweat running down her face. Her body ached, every muscle screaming for rest. She had been sold, cast out, treated like property by her town. Now, she was treated like a burden by the man who had purchased her. The thought struck her with a painful clarity. Caleb Boone could have been the escape, the protector, the chance at something different. And yet, in his quiet distance, he reminded her that she was still nothing more than a tool to be used, shaped, molded. Caleb watched her struggle with the firewood, his expression unreadable. He had seen the fatigue in her eyes, the trembling in her hands, the way she bit her lip to keep from speaking. And he had seen something else too, the fierce endurance, the stubborn will to survive, the quiet intelligence that kept her alive even when she was beaten down by the world. He knew, with a growing unease, that buying her had not freed her from cruelty. It had simply placed her under a different hand, his own, and he wondered if he was any better than the town that had sold her. "Do not rest until the chores are done," Caleb said again, his voice calm but firm. "You will not stop until the work is finished." Sarah nodded, swallowing her pride and forcing herself to stand. She returned to the chores, each movement mechanical, precise, her mind retreating into quiet calculation. She could endure this. She had endured worse. She would endure anything, as long as she remained alive. That was the rule she had learned long ago. That was the only law that mattered. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip behind the mountain ridges, casting long shadows over the cabin. Sarah had completed the majority of her chores, but she was bone-tired, muscles trembling, hands blistered. Caleb finally approached her, his presence quiet, almost silent. He did not offer praise. He did not offer comfort. He simply regarded her, noting the strain in her body, the fatigue in her eyes. "You have been through much," he said finally, his voice low, careful. "More than I can understand. And yet you endure. You continue. That is something I cannot ignore." Sarah did not respond. She did not want to hear sympathy, not now, not ever. She had survived by relying on her silence, on her endurance, on the unspoken rule that she must obey to survive. Any words of comfort felt foreign, unwanted, dangerous. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, on her hands, on the floorboards beneath her boots. Caleb studied her, his mind turning over the sight of her working tirelessly, of her posture stiff with discipline, of her face set in quiet determination. He knew now, with a clarity that was almost painful, that buying her had not erased the cruelty she had endured. It had not freed her from fear, from the habits of obedience she had learned in response to a world that had tried to destroy her. And in that knowledge, he felt a weight settle on his shoulders. Had he simply continued the cycle, placing her under a different authority, a different burden? The sun dipped fully below the horizon, leaving the cabin bathed in the muted blue light of dusk. Sarah had completed most of her tasks. She moved to the hearth to add firewood, her hands shaking from exhaustion. Caleb did not move to help. He did not offer words of relief. He simply stood nearby, a silent witness to her labor, a measure of her endurance. And yet, in his stillness, there was a strange acknowledgement. He saw the life that had been forced into survival, the endurance shaped by cruelty, and he understood that her strength was not broken. It was hardened. It was precise. It was relentless. He could see, in every movement, the life that the town had tried to erase, the spark that they had attempted to smother. And for the first time, he recognized that purchasing her had placed him in a position of responsibility, not ownership. And that responsibility carried weight heavier than any labor he could ask of her. Sarah collapsed into a chair near the hearth, finally allowing herself a brief moment of rest. Her arms and legs trembled from exhaustion. She could feel the ache of her muscles in every joint, the rawness of her hands from work and sun, the tightness in her chest from constant vigilance. She had worked to survive, to obey, to endure, and she had succeeded. Caleb remained standing, his eyes on her, thoughtful, troubled. He had not intended to be cruel. He had not intended to treat her as a burden. But in the quiet, he could not ignore the truth. Her life had been shaped by cruelty long before he had arrived, and every command, every expectation he placed on her now echoed the authority of those who had sold her for pennies. He was confronted with the moral question he could not escape. Had he truly saved her, or had he simply shifted her suffering into his own hands? Sarah lowered her head, closing her eyes briefly. The cabin was quiet, except for the fire, the faint rustle of the trees outside, and the rhythm of her own breathing. She was tired, battered, exhausted, and yet she endured. It was what she had always done. And Caleb Boone, mountain man and stranger, observer of her labor, was beginning to understand that endurance could not be bought, obedience could not be forced, and strength could not be measured by submission alone. For the first time since arriving at his cabin, Sarah allowed herself to feel something other than fear. It was a quiet defiance, a stubborn awareness that she was more than a tool, more than a burden, more than the sum of her labors. She did not speak. She did not need to. Caleb could see it. He could see the life in her eyes, the persistence in her movements, the intelligence and courage beneath the wariness. And though he had kept his distance, he felt a growing awareness that saving her had placed him in a position he could not ignore. The responsibility to see her as a person, not a burden, not property, not a tool to be used. The night fell fully over the mountains, leaving the cabin in shadow, the firelight flickering across the walls. Sarah rested in the chair, muscles sore, body trembling, but mind alive with quiet resolve. Caleb remained standing, silent, reflecting on the consequences of his actions, on the labor he had demanded, on the life he had inherited the responsibility for. The mountain air was cool against the window pane, the scent of pine and earth filling the room. And in that quiet, Sarah Whitlock, treated like a burden yet enduring with the resilience of one who had survived worse, began to assert the first fragile stirrings of her own agency, her own quiet strength. In the shadow of Caleb Boone's observation, the mountain air was sharp and cold, but Sarah Whitlock hardly noticed it. She stood at the edge of the clearing near Caleb Boone's cabin, her hands clasped together, staring down toward Pine Ridge. The town lay quiet beneath the hills, unaware that its carefully buried secrets were now exposed in their entirety. The note that had reached Caleb Boone earlier had changed everything. What she had thought of as personal shame, as a lifetime of rejection, was not hers to bear at all. The town had sold her to hide the crimes of men they respected, to preserve reputations that were never hers to protect. For a long moment, Sarah's chest felt tight with the shock of understanding. She had prepared herself for rejection, for Caleb to turn her away once the truth became known. That had been her expectation for as long as she could remember. Every act of obedience, every silent endurance, had been her way of surviving a world that wanted nothing from her but her disappearance. Now, knowing that the disgrace she had carried was a lie, she felt an anger that burned hotter than any shame had before. Caleb stood behind her, silent but present. His hands rested on the wooden railing of the porch, strong, steady, unwavering. He had read the note, understood the lies, and watched her reaction with a quiet intensity that made her heart both ache and stabilize. She could feel the weight of his gaze, not the weight of ownership, but of responsibility, of recognition, of partnership. For the first time in years, she realized she did not need to carry the town's burden alone. "You will not return to them," Caleb said, his voice low, deliberate. "Not while I am here. You will not be discarded again. Not for their lies, not for their secrets. Your life is yours, and I will see to it." Sarah turned to him, searching his eyes. They were dark and steady, filled with a certainty that matched the mountains themselves. She felt tears prick her eyes, not for sorrow but for relief, for the astonishing realization that someone had chosen to fight for her, to stand with her against a town that had sought to erase her existence. "They lied about me for their own safety," she said finally, her voice raw, trembling slightly. "All those years, I thought it was me. I thought it was my fault, but it was never mine to carry. Not ever." Caleb nodded. He had no words of comfort, no hollow reassurances. He only stood, silent and strong, letting her own words anchor her in the truth. She had endured humiliation, labor, and betrayal. She had survived being sold for pennies, being treated as a burden, and being forced to obey to live. And now, the truth had revealed itself. The town's guilt had no place in her life, no claim on her spirit. "Your future begins here," Caleb said finally. "Not with Pine Ridge, not with their lies. It begins now, and you decide what it will be. I will stand with you." The words settled over her, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt a freedom she could not have imagined months ago. She did not need to shrink, to hide, to prepare for rejection. She could stand, straight and proud, as herself. And there was a man beside her who would see her, not as a burden, not as a property, not as a scapegoat, but as a person worthy of protection, respect, and perhaps more than that. Sarah took a deep breath, letting the wind fill her lungs, and looked out at the town below. She could see the streets, the buildings, and the houses of those who had betrayed her. Anger still burned in her chest, but it no longer weighed her down. Instead, it fueled a sense of clarity. She had survived every humiliation, every labor, every silent fear. And now she could take the next step, reclaim her life fully, without shame, without fear, without anyone else's judgment defining her. Caleb watched her closely, noticing the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders straightened, the way her gaze sharpened with resolve. He understood fully that she was not merely enduring anymore. She was claiming herself, asserting her existence against the lies and cruelties of Pine Ridge. And in that moment, he felt the depth of his own responsibility. Buying her had been the first act. Protecting her from the immediate cruelty of the market had been the second. Now came the hardest step, standing against the town itself. The sun climbed higher, scattering light across the cabin and the mountainside. Caleb moved to gather firewood, working alongside Sarah, his presence steady and calm. There was no authority in his movements now, only partnership. He did not order her to labor, he simply worked, and she followed, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because she could. Because she had reclaimed her strength and her agency. The work itself, once a symbol of punishment and endurance, now felt like the first act of freedom. She could choose to work, to act, to live on her own terms. When the chores were done, they stood together on the porch, surveying the valley below. The wind rustled the pines around them, carrying the scent of earth and resin, carrying with it the possibility of a life beyond the town's lies. Sarah realized she was no longer trembling with fear. Her hands were still rough, her muscles still aching, but she stood upright and solid, the weight of shame lifted from her shoulders. She had survived the marketplace, the labor, and the cruelty. She had endured, and now she could live. Caleb shifted slightly, keeping his gaze on the town. They tried to bury you, hide you, erase you, he said. But that ends here. If they come, if they threaten, we will face them together. Your life is no longer theirs to dictate. Sarah's chest rose and fell steadily. She felt the first real warmth of hope in years, a fire that was hers alone. She met Caleb's eyes, and for the first time allowed herself to see something beyond survival: safety, protection, respect, and perhaps even the beginnings of trust, the fragile stirrings of connection. I do not want their forgiveness, she said, voice firm. I do not want their approval. I want my life. I want to be free. And if you are here with me, then I can be. Caleb's lips pressed into a line. He nodded, the mountains around them silent witnesses to the weight and significance of her words. Then that is what you will have, not because I bought you, not because the town owes you, but because you are worth it, because you deserve it. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting the cabin in the soft glow of evening. The shadows lengthened, and the mountains seemed to stretch forever, a vast, untouchable sanctuary. Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time. The labor, the cruelty, the lies, all of it was behind her now. The future, however uncertain, was hers to claim. And Caleb Boone, steady as the mountains themselves, stood beside her, a witness and protector, offering partnership and strength rather than ownership. For hours, they stood there in quiet companionship, surveying the valley, listening to the wind, feeling the fire die down in the hearth, and letting the silence of the mountains speak louder than any words could. Sarah's thoughts drifted to Pine Ridge, to the town that had tried to erase her, and she felt a sharp clarity. They had no power over her anymore. She had endured everything they had thrown at her, and she had survived. And now, she was whole. The first stars appeared in the sky above, pale points of light scattered across the deepening blue. Sarah turned to Caleb, and this time she did not flinch, she did not shrink, she did not brace for rejection. She allowed herself to meet his gaze fully, and she saw in him a reflection of her own resolve, her own strength, her own reclaimed dignity. For the first time, she did not feel like a woman discarded and sold. She felt like a woman who had reclaimed her life, her power, and her right to exist on her own terms. Caleb reached out, his hand brushing hers gently, not demanding, not commanding, simply acknowledging her presence, her strength, her survival. Sarah felt the warmth of the touch, steady and grounding, and she allowed herself to lean slightly into it. Not because she owed him, not because she needed protection, but because she could. Because she had earned it. Because she was no longer broken, no longer discarded, no longer defined by the cruelty of others. The mountains held them in a quiet embrace, the wind rustling through the pines, carrying the scent of freedom, carrying the weight of truth. Pine Ridge could not touch her, could not dictate her life, could not undo the years she had endured or the strength she had claimed. She was Sarah Whitlock, survivor, redeemed, and whole. And Caleb Boone, mountain man and steadfast protector, was beside her, not as a savior in the way the town had claimed to offer, but as a partner, a witness, and a man who understood the cost of survival and the weight of truth. The night settled fully over the mountains, stars sparkling like distant promises. Sarah felt her heart loosen, her chest rise without the weight of shame, and she allowed herself a single, long breath of pure air, sharp and clean. She had survived the market, the labor, the cruelty, and the lies. She had faced rejection and deceit. She had endured punishment and humiliation. And now she had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her future. And in that quiet, in the heart of the mountains above Pine Ridge, Sarah Whitlock and Caleb Boone stood together, the past behind them, the town powerless to define them, and the future wide open, unclaimed, and full of possibility. She was no longer a woman discarded. She was a woman reborn. Her past tried to define her, but she chose her own path and found someone who would stand with her through it all. What would you do if the world turned against you, but one person believed in your truth? Comment below your thoughts and share if you believe in second chances.